Whenever I think of Mike, if I can call you Mike, I don't know what you called in the States now. Are you Michael, or
Mike's fine.
Good. We're on a firm ground here. Whenever I think of Michael, I do think of someone who is one of the most inspiring educators that I have come across in my life. And I've had the fortune to know Mike probably for most of my life, and always as an educator, and most importantly then as an educator of educators. Not satisfying himself just with providing an education, but always moving the field forward as well. Mike, I always found so fascinating because he wanted to understand behind the field that he was in, really and truly understanding it, and then being able to put it into practice and to move it forward to provide a new generation of educators. I could go through a whole resume, but you can Google that yourselves. Most importantly, his best teacher that he ever had was his first teacher, and that was my mum in Birmingham Progressive Synagogue's Cheder a decent number of years ago. But it's these kinds of connections that are so important within liberal Judaism, the liberal Judaism family, but also the pride, the deep pride we feel in seeing our children, I know mine's a little bit older than me, but our children succeeding in the particular fields that they choose to find themselves in. It's been an honor to call Mike a colleague for a decent number of years now. And I'm so happy to be able to welcome you here this evening. And also, as many of us are, fascinated to hear where you're going to take this subject tonight, hearing Leah Baeck as a liberal Jew.
Well, thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Leah. Thank you to everyone. It's wonderful to be back in the liberal Jewish community, even though it's virtual. I'm sitting here in Boston, Massachusetts. It's the afternoon. You're all into the evening already. So I hope that we'll have this rewarding time together. I know it's been very rewarding up to now, and I know you've had some very interesting sessions. Last year when we were doing some sessions for liberal Judaism, Leah and I were talking about how liberal Judaism has always been at the forefront of adult learning and of keeping us up to date with learning. And of course, I think back to the time of the Evening Institute at the Montague Center when Rosita was working and Greta was in the office, and Sydney, of course. I used to sit on the desk for the Evening Institute and enroll people. And of course, Andrew was leading the charge with Charles for the program, a bit like a little limud of its day, a kind of limud before its time. And we all remember that adult learning for those of us who were in London at the time. And I suppose this is the 21st century version of the Evening Institute. So we're back learning together. So I want to talk a little bit tonight about Rabbi Leo Baeck and how he intersects with the ideas of the liberal movement, and maybe a little bit about how the liberal movement could take some of his ideas into the future. Some of the ideas are obviously go way back into a time and a place that's not ours anymore, but some of the ideas are particularly, I think, profoundly appropriate for our own time and for looking at what liberal Judaism might be thinking about the rest of the 21st century. I'm going to share a PowerPoint, and I hope that we'll all be able to see that. And at sometimes I might ask people to read some passages for us. So I'm just going to check that you can see the slideshow in presentation.
Perfect.
Great. So here's the first picture. I'm going to do a little potted history of Rabbi Leo Baeck. Many of us know the history, but this is just so that everyone, certainly those of a new generation, will get a sense of the importance and significance of his life, because his life really reflects his thinking, and his thinking reflects his life. He really lived out the thinking that he believed in and the philosophy of his Judaism, and it's important that we put that into the context. You will all know this picture, I imagine. I imagine you know who's in it. This is, of course, Leo Baeck in his late 70s, with Lily Montague and Martin Buber. And this was taken at the LGS in the late 1940s when Leo Baeck came for the World Union for Progressive Judaism conference. And there's a wonderful depiction of the three greats of our own ideology, of our own liberal philosophy, and puts them together very nicely in this photograph. But let's go back to Leo Baeck as a young man. He grew up in Poland. His father was a rabbi, and he went to rabbinical school very early. In fact, he went to two rabbinical schools. One was not enough for him, first in Breslau and then Berlin. And he was someone who was both a scholar and a rabbi at the same time, and became someone who was very important in the life of the German reform movement, but also across all of German Jewry, and was accepted as such as he grew in stature over his time. His first pulpit, however, was in a very small little Polish town called Oppeln. It happened to be where my grandfather and my great-grandparents were members. So this kind of out of the way provincial congregation in Oppeln was his first pulpit, and he there had a very good experience. This was, I think, one of the happiest times of his life, because he met there his wife, who was the granddaughter of the previous rabbi, Natalie Hamburger, and here you see them, two of them together. They had a wonderful marriage. He relied on her in many different ways. Sadly, she died early in 1938, and she's buried in Berlin. And he was a widower then for the next 20 years of his life. But up to the late 1930s, they had a wonderful marriage and really were an ezer kenegdo, a helpmate for each other. She was considered the beauty of the town of Oppeln, and she got to marry the young, handsome rabbi with his handlebar moustache, and he got to marry the young beauty of the town, which was a nice combination. He obviously experienced the First World War, and although by that time he had left Oppeln and he was now in Dusseldorf as a community rabbi, he volunteered to act as a chaplain for the German forces in the First World War, and he was sent both to the Western Front, to Normandy, and then to the Eastern Front to see really what the ravages of war were really like firsthand. And this really did determine and change his views, which we'll talk about in a minute, as to how God's presence in the world and how human beings treat each other. And in many ways, it was a litmus test for what he was to experience in the Second World War. And the fact that he had experienced much of the horror of the First World War never really changed his mind about the nature of God or the nature of the evil that people do to each other, because he had seen it firsthand, and that remained with him all his life. During the 1920s, as he was getting into middle age, he became the most prominent rabbi in Germany. He was president of a number of associations, both cultural and religious, and he particularly became very involved in the emergence of the World Union for Progressive Judaism that had its inaugural conference in Berlin in 1928. But further and beyond what was called in Germany Reform Judaism, although he called himself a liberal Jew, that was the word he used, liberal in German, because Reform Judaism in Germany had a number of varieties of flavor and tone, and he put himself squarely in the camp of being a liberal Jew, a liberal Jew. He was also elected president of the B'nai B'rith organization and was very involved in Jewish welfare organizations in Berlin and in Germany. By this time, he had moved to Berlin, and he was one of the rabbis of the Einheitsgemeinde, the German community rabbinate, which toured and rotated around the different Berlin synagogues. And then he also began to teach at the Hochschule, the Reform Religious Seminary, of which he had been a student. And he taught Midrash at the seminary, that was his field. But he also taught other things. He was particularly interested in Jewish history and also in Kabbalah, which was perhaps a somewhat unusual subject for a Reform seminary. I'm not sure yet whether Baeck College in London yet teaches Kabbalah, but he was teaching it in the Hochschule. And we'll talk a little bit about his attachment to mysticism and mystery a little later on. Of course, as the 1930s approached and German Jewry was officially, as he himself announced, coming to an end of its 1,000-year history, the tragedy of the Shoah and of the beginnings of the Reich, the German Reich, really obviously impacted all of German Jewry. That's a whole story in and of itself. And I think most people know the story of Rabbi Leo Baeck during the Shoah. So I'm not going to dwell really on it, just to say that, again, he was on the outside as he was on the inside. There's a rabbinic phrase, tocho kavaro, and that's applied to Leo Baeck, that he retained his dignity, his belief in Judaism as a noble enterprise. He never wavered from the mission of Judaism as he saw it throughout that difficult time. He did become the premier representative of the German community, and particularly the Berlin community, to the Nazi authorities. And there are many stories about his meetings with Eichmann and how he was treated and how he treated them. And the fact that they were somewhat in awe and in reverence of his presence. Here is a picture of him in Theresienstadt. As you know, by 1942, he was deported to Theresienstadt, but he did not stop there. First of all, he was employed as a laborer, but then as he turned his 70th birthday, he was able to lead the educational program in Theresienstadt, which was a secret program of nighttime lectures. And as you can see here, he's wearing his Star of David on his jacket. Baeck always dressed in a jacket and tie. I wore my tie in honor today. He was never seen without a jacket and tie, even in concentration camp. I'm grateful to Andrew, who took my daughter Anya and myself around Theresienstadt just pre-COVID, and we had a real sense and insight into what the place was like, what it must have been like for him with all the deprivations that were there. But he did survive, as we know. And the Dublin people might recognize this picture because he became very involved in the development of progressive communities around the world. He spent 6 months a year in London and 6 months a year in Cincinnati at Hebrew Union College, teaching the rabbinical students there. While he was in England, he would participate in reform and liberal activities. He himself had a more of a traditional practice, and therefore felt comfortable praying at Northwest Reform Aleph Synagogue, and he was there every week. And he was asked to do the priestly benediction at the end of the service, and it was said that when he gave the priestly benediction, you could feel God's presence in the room. He, however, was also connected to the liberal movement and had been throughout his life. He had corresponded with Lily Montagu and had obviously been involved with Lily Montagu and Claude Montefiore and Israel Matic throughout his time in the 20s when he was, and the 30s. And indeed, he was elected president of the World Union in the late 30s and then became life president of the World Union in the 50s. This is a picture from Dublin. It's 1949. In the picture, you'll see Rabbi Leo Baeck in the front with his glasses. Behind him is David Finkel, that is Joan Finkel's father. To the right of him in the picture is my grandfather, Dr. Ernst Shire, who was also connected, living in Dublin and connected to the Dublin Progressive Synagogue. And to the right is Henry Lowe, who is Brian Lowe's father. So some of the three founders of Dublin Progressive, and Rabbi Baeck being there for a lecture and to help participate in the growth and the development of that congregation. He did attend other liberal synagogues, and maybe afterwards in the Q&A we can hear more about maybe people who have experienced a visit to a liberal synagogue from him. He was involved in the reconsecration of the LGS in 1951. He carried the Sefer Torah into the new sanctuary, and was asked to participate also in the 50th anniversary of the liberal Jewish movement, again at the LGS in 1952. And finally, also perhaps to make connection to all of our friends and colleagues, as we know, Rabbi Harry Jacobi, Zichrono Livracha, was very influenced by Leo Baeck throughout his life, and was called to the rabbinate by Leo Baeck, and felt that Leo Baeck had always been, in a way, his teacher, although he didn't study with him. We also know that he, interestingly enough, and I didn't know this, but he was involved in the consecration of the Montague Center, which wasn't called that at the time, of Whitfield Street, West Central Synagogue. And he was particularly involved in ensuring that liberal Judaism found the strength it needed to develop itself. He was very interested in the future of liberal and progressive Judaism worldwide. So let's go on to talk a little bit about his thought and how it applies perhaps to us today. First of all, to say that he comes from a Prussian background, and that Prussian background is heavily influenced in Germany in the Reform movement by what are called the Neo-Kantians. And I know we're going to get into the heavy thinking now, but I kind of want to make this as easy as possible. So Neo-Kantianism and its leader, Hermann Cohen, suggested that God is known through three branches of knowledge. So the three ways to know something, and those three ways are both comprehensive and total. They encompass all of knowing, and they divide up between logic, ethics, and aesthetics. That is logic, reason, the use of our mind, the rationality which we use to come to understand how we make decisions in life, in the world. That's a very important part of the human endeavor, the human makeup. And of course, it's got to contribute to the notion of how we know anything, including God. Ethics is the nature of the good, the nature of what is right about the way in which we act, how we are right in the societies we create, the righteous way of being. That is also obviously crucially important in how we act in the world. And then there's the realm of aesthetics that ranges from everything that is sublime, everything that is part of our emotional life, everything that is part of our ritual life. And these three things are very important in the Kantian and Neo-Kantian way of understanding how the world works and how humanity works in the world. There is a separate category that we'll discuss shortly, and that is a sense of the holy. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And then finally, this notion of these three areas, branches of knowledge come together, they bind themselves together, and they transcend them. And we, in what Hermann Cohen called the God idea. So I have a schema, which we're going to come back to and revisit a few times. It's the schema of Baeck's view of what we're eventually going to call religious consciousness. But it starts in this area where the red circle is. So you can see there the three components of knowing: reason, ethics, and aesthetics, and that Hermann Cohen's idea that they are bound together and are transcended by what's called the God idea. It's almost like the highest form of thinking and knowing that we can actually, as human beings, come to understand, and that we will call the God idea. Now, for Hermann Cohen, it was definitely an idea. It was something that was beyond us to know, but it was an important part of the rationality, of the reason of our mind's work. And that's why Hermann Cohen called it the God idea. But we can't really live with that, and Baeck couldn't either, in the sense that it's not enough just to have an idea. It doesn't necessarily create a religious impulse. a move towards an ethical imperative. It's really just a way of considering how we can know something, but it's very important. And this is where Baeck wanted us to go. And I'm going to maybe, if we could just, Tom can unmute someone and we could have someone read this. Maybe I should choose someone. In fact, David Lippman was there earlier, and he's such a wonderful voice. David, would you be prepared to read this for us? If David's still with us.
Not eating his dinner.
Right, he might be.
Ask him to unmute, but I think he's.
I don't think he's with us. So let's we can ask David for something later. Let's go to well, our chairman, Ruth.
This challenging, this challenging idea is firstly the one thing that alone is needful, that which has been commanded, the good, the right. Secondly and mainly, it means the one being who has proclaimed this one thing and demands it from humanity, the one God beside whom there is none else. And finally, it means the unity and totality of humanity. It means that through this one thing, and therefore with their whole heart and soul, humanity is to serve the one God and God only.
Thank you. It's a tough, dense paragraph, but what I think it's saying here, and I think it's exactly what Lily Montagu felt as well, and this was written, by the way, around 1905, and you'll remember that Lily Montagu had written her first essay in the Jewish Chronicle of the spiritual possibilities of Judaism today at the turn of the century, 1899. So here is Baeck writing around the same, he must have penned it around the same time, although it's published in 1905 in his book, The Essence of Judaism. And what we're beginning to see is here is a real emergence of a religious way of knowing God that is grounded in a universalism, that is a sense of the whole human family, and a totality of a being. That is, that to be a religious person is to be someone who understands and knows God and knows what God wants us to respond to God's demands call. It's not a God that is just an idea anymore. It's a God who actually demands something of us. It's a God who's calling to us. It's a God who we know that we need to respond to. And this is a God who actually acts in human history. It's a God that Baeck felt very comfortable describing because as a religious historian as well, with a real interest in Midrash, which of course is the language and the literature that describes kind of how God works in the world and how we can come to understand that relationship. For Lily Montagu, for Claude Montefiore, for Israel Matic, the new movement, the liberal movement, the turn of the century, had to be a religious movement. It had to be a movement grounded in the knowledge of God that had to have a religious essence. And essence of Judaism is what Baeck calls his book. This notion of oneness, of course, is this combination of these three ways of knowing. It is requirement that we would, in this sense of knowing, that we would have a unity, and that unity is something that becomes an ideal. We want to live towards, we want to have an ideal experience where these things come together, where the commanded, the good, that is the ethical, and the right come together. And this is a real theme in Baeck's writing about the combination of these things and how they need to be combined in order to become integrated and to become known as one, which of course is part of our liturgy. On that day, God will be known as one. But there's a second aspect, and you've probably picked this up, because it can't only be about the oneness. It can't only be about our notion of bringing this one idea to our way of being, but it's got to be combined with something else. So David's back with us. I would love to, if David would be able to read this.
Thank you, Mike. The new principle is often succinctly called ethical monotheism. This name is meant to denote that the root of this doctrine is ethical. The unity and exclusiveness of the moral demand imply the unity of God. When people came to see that good and true and holy are only different names for one thing, that to this one thing all people are to devote themselves, and for its sake turn away from all else, God was recognized as the one, the holy.
Thank you very much. Again, the combination highlights the fact that we need the good, which here is the ethical, the true, that is the nature of how we understand what is truth, and the holy. And for Baeck, you could see he was beginning to move a little bit beyond the way the Neo-Kantians expressed their sense of knowing, because he was now including another dimension, a dimension that hadn't yet been fully developed. Certainly it was not fully developed in the first edition of his book, The Essence of Judaism, in 1905, but he revised it in the late 20s, the 1928, and these passages are adapted, and he brings into his thinking this notion of the holy. And we're going to talk a bit more about what he means by that. But these are aspects of knowing God for him, and that they need to find a way in our lives that we bring what is true, what we think of as truth, what we think is kind of the most important way we can reason, along with what we know to be the right way, the good thing, the righteous mode of living, along with that which is what he begins to call a religious consciousness, a sense that our sense of knowing can also come from other spheres, from within us, and from an ability to perceive God in a spiritual manner. That was not where the Neo-Kantians had been, and it turns us a little bit away from a very, if you like, aesthetic Judaism, one that the early classical reformers had decided was the bare minimum of what you needed in order to participate in Jewish life. And there is a sense here in Baeck that we are beginning to see that he wants to turn in a slightly new direction towards something that has more of a connection that is relational to the God that we are talking about, rather than being an objective idea that is only held in the mind. This begins to enter into difficult territory, and territory I think that we're still grappling with today. And I do want to emphasize the ethical, because of course this stands out both in liberal Judaism and in Baeck's writings. The Affirmations of liberal Judaism that Rabbi John Rayner put together really as the very first distinctive element of liberal Judaism demonstrates that our commitment to the ethical has got to be unwavering, and has got to be not just because we feel it is the right thing to do, because we feel obligated. We feel that we are commanded to make sure that the ethical is a primacy of our religious life. That takes it away a little bit from the sense of volition, of autonomy, which the Neo-Kantians were interested in, your free choice to make your own choice about what you want to do in religion. That was definitely part of kind of the early reform movement. But here, there's beginning to be a sense that we are bound, we are obligated to ensure that ethics is the primacy of our religious life. Let's see, who can we ask to read now? I'm obviously, not everyone is on my screen, but I see Bob Kirk there. Perhaps Bob, you would like to read this for us.
The sentence, "Hear, O Israel, the Eternal One our God, the Eternal is one," is immediately followed by another. "You shall love the Eternal, thy God, with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might." To the Hebrew mind, these two sentences are inseparable because the certainty of the unity of God is inseparable from the certainty of the unity of commandment and from the certainty that humanity achieves our unity by keeping the commandment.
I think we need to, thank you, Bob. I think we need to say a word about commandment. For Baeck, and this is actually very topical because this week we are moving from Yitro to Mishpatim in our Shabbat readings. And, you know, Yitro has been this wonderful description of the giving of the 10 Commandments, to Mishpatim, which is a whole set of individual laws that become part of actually the movement of the Torah from now is going to be much more about laws than it is about the story and the notion of revelation. Revelation really is, if you like, it's focused at Yitro, and then we kind of move into, if you like, case law, as it's called. But for Baeck, it wasn't about the number of commandments. It wasn't about the multitude of things we were commanded to do. For Baeck, the notion of commandments was about the commander. It was about the mitzaver, the person who obligates us. For Baeck, those commandments could change over time. They didn't get stuck in one format, but rather for Baeck, his emphasis was the idea that we are commanded, we are obligated, we are putting ourselves voluntarily, but we're putting ourselves in a position where we will respond to a commandment, the commandment. And he calls the commandment in German Gebot, and it's always written with a capital C. It's not about the multitude, the 10 or the 613, it's about the one. It's about the one commandment to give us a real sense that the Hebrew religion was a revolution in its time, to create a set of laws and injunctions and righteous opportunities that were based within a divine call. That had never been talked about before in any of the ancient societies. This was about God giving us a sense that we had to think about ourselves as under obligation. And that's why for Baeck, duty and the call to obligation was very important. And as you can begin to see, that's the way he lived out his life. Nothing else was available to him. He could only do that which was a response to the call for duty, which is of course why he remained in Germany and did not accept invitations to leave Germany while there were people, Jews, left still in Germany that he was there to minister to. So he puts together these two sentences that are very famous for us, Shema Yisrael with Ve'ahavta. I am God, I am the eternal God, and immediately follows that with you shall, thou shalt. Michael Meyer, who's written a wonderful new book on Leo Baeck called Rabbi Leo Baeck, Living a Religious Imperative in Troubled Times, has made a distinction, and I think this might be helpful for people who know Martin Buber, made a distinction between Buber and Baeck. Buber, also interested in religious consciousness, also interested in this kind of relational notion of our relationship to God, talks about I and thou. I think many people know that schema. Baeck differs from Buber and Michael Meyer suggests that Baeck's, if you like, mantra is I and thou shalt. So I am the Lord your God, I am Adonai your God, and thou shalt. There's always a reciprocal ethical call upon us whenever we accept our relationship with God. We can't just be in relationship with God for its own sake. We have to see what is our obligation, our response to that revelation, which is how Baeck understood revelation. Revelation is a call for us to do something. And that's why Baeck understood that Judaism was not a religion of ideological beliefs. We don't have a faith confession. We don't have a set of beliefs that we're required to believe in, but rather Judaism is a set of actions, but they're grounded in a divine realization. I'm going to move on to our schema again. And to summarize the slide that I just skipped, is just to say that obviously the reality of Jewish life is not always that everyone can aspire to the highest ideals. Baeck himself, who had witnessed the change in German society, including the rise of anti-Semitism, but also the decline in Jewish practice, and the notion of religion in what was becoming a modernist, but then eventually a postmodernist world, was declining in attracting people to the force of what it had been. So he came under the influence of two thinkers. One was the Protestant theologian who had lived 100 years earlier, Schleiermacher, who had understood religion as really a part of the aesthetic branch of knowing. It is the sublime, the emotional, the one that is dependent upon what the God that you believe in is telling you to do. Baeck understood that religious way of knowing is not exactly the same as rationality. It's not the same as reason. It's not equal to ethics, although ethics is primacy. And it's not solely about the sublime. And so he wasn't happy with this notion that religion could only be attached, if you like, as a way of knowing to the ritualistic, the symbolic. The ritualistic was not enough. Just to perform the mitzvot, just to perform the rituals of Judaism were not enough to enact this notion of being obligated to respond to God. So he managed to become friendly with and connected with Rudolf Otto, who in 1917 published a book called The Idea of the Holy. And in this, Otto proposed an idea that there was actually another way of knowing. There's a way of knowing that he called the numinous. This is not connected to rationality. In fact, it can be irrational to believe. For Otto, it was separate from the ethics and it was separate from the aesthetics. But it was a compelling idea, and Baeck particularly appreciated the fact that religious experience, or religious consciousness, as he came to call it, is a part of our religious lives. And as liberal Jews, I think still for us today in the 21st century, we're still kind of coming to understand how the religion of our own ancestors, that is Montesquieu, Matic, and Montefiore, can connect to a real sense of presence in devotion to God's word and to the ways in which we can live our lives in a religious manner. I think Lily Montagu understood this very inherently, particularly as she used the word spiritual in her very first essay in that famous passage in 1899. I was looking through the Affirmations of Liberal Judaism that John Rayner wrote in the 1980s, 90s, and I know it's been revised, but the word spiritual or religious consciousness or mystery indeed does not appear in any of those affirmations. So it's a part of liberal Judaism that I think, looking to the future now, that may be challenging for us to begin to recapture the thinking that both Baeck proposed and that others in our religious tradition have kind of held on to for a while. The way Baeck wrote about it was he wrote about it as mysticism. Now, as I said earlier, he had been a teacher and a student of Kabbalah, but he didn't believe that kind of mysticism was the kind of mysticism we wanted. He thought that kind of mysticism, the mysticism of the Kabbalah, of metaphysical speculation about what God was like, was not what we needed. That was a distraction. It had been helpful, he thought, in Jewish history, but it was a distraction from our current work. When he writes about mysticism, and of course, remember he's writing in German, I think perhaps we could replace that word with religious consciousness or spirituality, depending on what word you prefer. So let's look at a passage that he did write about what he thought mysticism had been and what it was for the future. So maybe we could, there's Louise Friedman. Maybe Louise, you would read for us.
Mysticism lifted the Jews above the arid channels of their existence, above their constraints and fears. It was able to deliver the wondrous stillness of the far away, the descending world of the Sabbath. Mysticism designates that which lies beyond inquiry, that which belongs to God and not to human beings, that of which one can have no more than a notion. The commandment is true commandment only because it arises from the mystery, and the mystery is true mystery because the commandment always speaks from its midst.
And Louise, oh, thank you, Louise. That's wonderful. I just want to show you on the schema how that works. So now we're into the orange circle. So what Baeck is saying here is that this notion of the numinous, the mystery, the religious consciousness that we can personally feel has brought us to a relationship with the presence of God has to combine with something else to make it into a religious system that is satisfactory and continues to respond to this call for us to be good, holy, and true. And therefore he combines, as you can see, the numinous with the ethics and the aesthetics. Now, of course, what happens, first of all, is that this leaves out the reason, leaves out rationality. It's not that it's not there anymore. It's just not the main factor, the primacy of how Baeck understood what religion was actually offering. Now, when we think about it for the 20th century, we can understand that reason has been kind of this notion that the mind can know everything about the world, that our human capacity for cognitive ability is the be-all and end-all of everything in life. That has been something that I think has moved on from the time of Kant and the Neo-Kantians. And Baeck understood this as well, that reason cannot be the default by which we turn to every situation in our lives. Sometimes reason will not help us when we are mourning a loved one, or we are in the face of injustice, when we have to perhaps deprive ourselves of something that we hold dear in order to serve someone else. Remember, Baeck did exactly that. He, in a sense, was prepared to be a martyr in his own life in order to serve the Jewish community of Germany. So this notion that we got to be beyond just reason, that there is something in the human spirit that comes from our religious consciousness, that it's got to be combined very significantly and in that integrated and transcendent manner with the ethical as well. So this is what Baeck calls religious consciousness, and it's summed up perhaps, as we said earlier, in this notion that I am the eternal your God, you shall. These two have got to always be put together. I think I'll move on to this last slide, and I'm hoping then we'll have enough time for questions. So maybe, let's see, who do we have that I can call upon? I see Rabbi Roberta Harris-Eckstein, so wonderful if you could read for us.
Essentially Jewish is the inner unity, unity therefore with all of its tension, the ethical and the mystical, the earthly and the cosmic, the unity of mitzvah and kavanah, or what has the same meaning of Torah and Shabbat. Mystery and commandments connect with each other. Only the two together give full meaning to our lives. The unity of the two is religion in the manner that Judaism possesses it. If liberal Judaism were to be vibrant, it could not ignore the transcendent mystery. It could not rest on moral action alone. Mysticism would supply the certainty of the unmediated connection to God.
Which I think is a wonderful summary of kind of where we have taken this journey from kind of a very rationalist understanding of a God idea through an attempt to understand how religious consciousness, spirituality, the notion of knowing in a new and different way becomes an important idea in our postmodern world, and then how to combine those with the primacy of ethics to make sure that touchy-feely religion isn't what we're talking about. It's not just about how we feel about our wonderful music, our liturgy, our religious rituals, even though that they are part of our tradition and that we honor and connect to them, can't be enough. We have to also ensure that our religious impulses reach out to others in order to do the acts of service we do, both within our own communities, but also outside of them, very importantly. And if we have time later, I can share with you a final statement of Baeck's with regarding its real importance of how we become part of our societies and indeed of the world. And of course, we can all be very proud that liberal Judaism itself has been an exemplar for its commitment to, whether it's immigration, refugees, climate change, gender diversity, and all of the issues that are currently in front of us. We as liberal Jews commit to working in those areas because we feel commanded and obligated in a religious manner to develop them. So we can see that Baeck brings Shabbat and Torah to the center of his work because it is also about the ways in which we live out our tradition, how to make Shabbat the exemplar moment of religious essence, but also of religious living. And that for us as liberal Jews, Shabbat is not about what you don't do, it's what you do, and what you do in the light of the teachings we've received, both from our liberal Jewish forebears and from the great and wonderful theologians of the 20th century, and now hopefully pushing us into the 21st century, as is Rabbi Leo Baeck. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much. Wow, Michael. I mean, really, I think we could probably, I know I can see people applauding. I hope you can see that too. I think we could have listened to you probably for 3 more hours, but you probably have a bit more energy still than we do because it's a bit later for us. But I think I was already thinking we definitely must do a follow-up on this in our blog on liberal Jewish thinking for our 120th year. So I'll be in touch with you about that. There were two questions or comments in the chat, which I thought I'll come to directly, and I'll sneak my own one in with that. But do please, to everyone, do please put your comments in there as well, and then also just raise your hand. So Dr. Peter Calver asked, would this reflect the concept of God as being, so this chart of kind of logic, ethics, and aesthetics, would this reflect the concept of God as being true, i.e. logic, good, ethics, and beauty, aesthetic, which strangely Balthasar also considered? So that was one of our questions. And the other question is about influences. Actually, we now have 2 questions on the influences. So John Heidemann is asking about the influence of Buber on Leo Baeck, and Andrew Hoffman is adding influence of Kierkegaard. And what I was wondering about is actually not so much maybe influence on Leo Baeck, but vice versa, Soloveitchik. Because when you were talking about that it's really not just about the commandments, but the commander, that sounded very Soloveitchik to me. And I think they overlapped in Berlin, if I'm not mistaken. But so I think that's enough questions. So we had the question about kind of this idea is that this graph, does that line up with Balthasar's thought as well? And then Buber, Kierkegaard, and Soloveitchik.
So I didn't, when you said line up with, what was the word after that? I didn't hear.
So the question was, would this reflect the concept of God as being true, where true is equal logic, good is equal ethics, and beauty is equal aesthetics, which also Balthasar considered?
Yes, so that's absolutely right. In terms of the second question, obviously we can do a whole course on theology, which would be wonderful. But let me focus on Buber, because Baeck and Buber and Rosenzweig had a very important relationship. And the way that that I think we can draw the picture is that Hermann Cohen influenced Baeck in this notion of the God idea, but then Baeck took that forward and included this notion of religious consciousness, combining it with ethics, and create, I should say that this was a very brief opening, that there's a system that religious theologians then create out of these original ideas, and that system has to apply to all of the different aspects that we all live with, whether it's the state of Israel and its importance in our religious thinking, whether it's obviously issues of the day, euthanasia, assisted living, assisted dying. The system itself then helps you begin to understand how to respond to some of the issues of the day. And that's what Baeck was doing when he was adding in these new elements to a religious system. What he did by opening that up was allow Buber and Rosenzweig to come up with their own systems, because he, in a sense, he had cracked the neo-Kantian pristine three ways of knowing and the God idea, and let Buber emerge with a new idea, which was that we can be in relationship with God. The difference, as I said earlier, is that Buber didn't feel there was any content to that revelation, that relational revelation, that the idea that God is with us, God is a companion with us. For Buber, it doesn't have any content. There's no requirement to do anything about that. In fact, as you may know, Buber moved to what was then Palestine, became Israel, and he found himself embedded within the Jewish peoplehood, but he didn't get involved himself with Jewish religion. So in a sense, I know Buber's very popular with lots of people, and it's kind of it's certainly it's become a very important concept of I thou and I eternal thou, and it's become very important in Christianity too to read Buber. But Buber doesn't really answer some of the questions that we liberal Jews have, which is what's the content of what we have to do if we feel obligated, we feel religious people. What's the content of what that is about? And for Baeck, it was thou shalt, the obligation, and then he begins to unpack the notion of Shabbat, of Torah, what that might mean if we are putting that in the context of this system. Rosenzweig also, Rosenzweig's concept of love, which is very important in his dimension, also is slightly different from Baeck. For Baeck, love was important, but again, it wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was obligation, was duty. So we have some slight differences, but I think Baeck was the corridor between, if you like, the Kantian, neo-Kantian world through religious consciousness, and then you come to what Buber was able to do. But I think it's because Baeck was able to start the ball rolling in 1905, and by the time Buber's writing in 1920, he's picking up these ideas.
Wonderful. Just Kathy Schock is writing in the comments about how wonderful it is to hear the numinous being talked about, something that so often gets left out of the equations as we focus on praise and commandment. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more on that.
Just to reiterate, I think as liberal Jews, this is some of our beginning to understand it in the context of what we've always thought about in terms of our ethical obligation. And as I said, the affirmation statements, it's a good time to be thinking about the new liberal Jewish affirmations and what we think has got to be added.
Wonderful. We've got two big questions for you, and only my German nature is noticing that we only really have 2 minutes left, but maybe people will forgive us if we run over by just a few moments, because the two questions are actually really interesting. So Tony Samuel from Oxford is asking, is there evidence that Baeck directly influenced our liturgy? So we have readings attributed to him, but did he directly influence our liturgy? And Owen Powers asking you, what do you think Leo Baeck's message to us would be as we celebrate our 120th birthday? What would he say that we are doing well, and what should we be doing better?
That's a wonderful question. It needs more than 2 minutes. There is actually, and I would refer you to a wonderful talk that, again, Professor Michael Meyer, who's at Hebrew Union College, gave at the 50th anniversary of Baeck College in 2005 when I was at the college. And that's an essay on Baeck's, I suppose, as you suggest, Owen, Baeck's message to us today. But in brief, I would just say to that he would be so pleased that progressive Judaism as a whole, and liberal Judaism in particular, is thriving, that we have congregations and a movement that is moving forward in a wonderful new way, that at the head we have a wonderful young woman, Rabbi Charlie Baginski, to lead us, but with a great and distinctive role of rabbis. Baeck really believed in the role of the rabbi scholar, the rabbi historian, the rabbi activist. He believed that rabbis had a very important place to play in our religious lives. And of course, he knew about the establishment of Baeck College in London in 1956, but he died before it was actually established. But then once it was established, it was named in his honor. So he knew that there was going to be a rabbinical college in London, and that, we're all very proud that the rabbis who have been produced from that college have led us in so many wonderful ways and pushed us forward and challenged us in all of our thinking. So I think, I don't know what Baeck would say about the specific issues of the day are. Obviously, you can never read forward into history, but I know that he would feel that there was still a time ahead, and he believed in a messianic age. There's a time ahead when liberal Judaism will become the force for good that it can be for all Jews, and indeed for all of society. And we still have a role to play, and he would expect us to move forward and to ensure that the next generation is better than the last.
Wow, what a way. I think this is where we're going to have to finish, because it's just fabulous. I know we didn't answer Tony's question, but it's just such a fabulous ending to a session.